Good morning, friends. Happy New Year. It's great to be with you this week as we're gathering to worship once again. Just a couple of days ago, we officially celebrated Epiphany in the life of the church. That comes 12 days after Christmas, the 6th day of January. And it is where the things like the 12 days of Christmas comes from. And also, if you are over in the Middle East or in the Orthodox Church, it's the day that they actually celebrate Christmas. So it doesn't happen on December 25th. But here in the United States, we celebrate Epiphany. Now, Epiphany is a word that we use in sort of everyday language to say like an aha moment. And I think that's actually a really helpful way to think about it. We talk about Epiphany as illuminating, as a light that comes. And so when we celebrate Epiphany as a church, we're talking about the light coming to dwell among us. So if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll get words like an appearance or a manifestation or a revelation or a clarification. All of those are words that are associated with Epiphany, both in the non-religious and the religious tradition. And so what we're talking about when we talk about Epiphany is celebrating the light of God come to dwell among us in Jesus Christ, the appearance of God on the scene who enlightens the world through Jesus. And so it is this eternal this eternal clarifying moment. And in Epiphany, a lot of times we play with the idea of light. We sort of use light as a symbol in the midst of this season. We also celebrate the Magi or the wise men coming and bringing their gifts to Jesus. And so if you were with us on Christmas Eve, you heard me talk about how the Magi show up a little bit late, probably more than 12 days late. But this is the time as a church where traditionally we have celebrated that. And so I want to read that story for us from Matthew 2, beginning in verse 1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child that has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all of the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called to the wise men and learned from them the exact time that the star had appeared. Then he sent them to go to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. And entering on the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. So, I want to talk about these magi for just a couple of minutes. Wise men, magi, we call them lots of different things, and we don't know a lot about them. We imagine them coming from the east, from a land that's sort of beyond most of what is in the consciousness of the scriptures. And I think they're meant to represent that. We sometimes give them names and personalities, and we imagine perhaps that there was 3 of them because there are 3 gifts, though the scripture never says that. We imagine that they must be learned scholars, though the scripture doesn't really say that. We imagine that maybe they're kings, we 3 kings, right? That's where the song comes from, but we don't really know that. In fact, we imagine a lot about these magi, about these wise men or wise people, but we know very little. And why do we know very little about them? I mean, they're in all of the manger scenes, and they bring the most important part of the manger scene with them, the camel. And if you've been a part of a living nativity, you know that that is most important. And so there's no camel actually in the story either. And I think about that, and I'm like, what is Matthew thinking? Did he not know that we would be very interested in camels in the 21st century, that would be a great outreach tool for us? There's so much that we don't know about the Magi. And why is that? The answer is actually quite simple. Because for Matthew, the story isn't about them. I mean, this particular story follows them, but they're a part of a greater narrative that is not about them. They're illustrating a point that has nothing to do with really who they are, except that they come from afar, that they're wise, and that they're foreigners. That's really what is most important, and perhaps their gifts. But for Matthew, none of it is about them. The story isn't about them. You know that the story is about Jesus. Matthew is concerned about Jesus. The author writing the gospel is concerned about Jesus. That's the story that he's trying to tell. And so these wise guys are really just to tell something, tell a fact, tell a story about Jesus. They signify that something substantial and something of international, worldwide import is happening. So I want to share this reflection from Derek Weber, and I think it's an interesting thing. I've adapted it a little bit, but he sort of imagines the scene when the Magi show up, and he says this: what we don't know about the wise men could fill whole encyclopedias. Oh, we've made stuff up because we don't like mystery all that much. We've given them a history and names. We've given them a story so we can wrap our minds around them a little bit more comfortably. We've constructed a scenario that makes sense, that sounds nice, that fits into a narrative that we've created for ourselves. But Matthew doesn't care about any of that. They are simply a component of the plot, a means to an end. The wise men aren't the point for Matthew. They are there simply as a way of announcing this birth. They are a sign pointing to something beyond themselves, something that gives them meaning and purpose, that makes them characters in the story, something that defines them. They are who they are and who they have come to be because of what they found in Jesus, because of who they found. And I love that. You see, friends, they play an important role in the story. But the story of the forest is much bigger and much more important than the story of the trees. So in this year of the story, we've been talking a lot about Donald Miller's book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. And that's actually a phrase that he uses. He writes in one chapter that in a particularly challenging time of his life, he discovered the work of Viktor Frankl, and particularly his logotherapy. If you've been following along in this year of the story, you've heard me talk about it. But part of what he learned, Miller says, is that we do well to remember that each of us have our own individual stories. We have agency and capacity. We are buzzing with possibility and potential, and that we're invited to live good and meaningful stories and to share that with the world, and that's important. But we're also characters in a larger story, God's story. And in that story, we are just individual characters. And God's story began a long time ago, and it's going to continue a long time after us. But we get to play a part. We get to have a role in that. And what he says is he realized that he was a tree in the story about a forest, and that it was misguided of him not to understand that. And he said that the story of the forest was better than the story of the tree. Friends, we do well to remember that's true for us. The story of the wise men, it's not really about them, but about their lives and their journey, pointing to the mercy and the magnitude of what God is doing in this moment. We celebrate Epiphany, the aha, the realization, the light that comes to illuminate the darkness, that provides clarity. That's what we're celebrating. And these wise men are an illustration, a manifestation of that, to help us realize just how powerful and how important this child, this infant born among these people will become. Today is Aha Day because it has significance, and these wise men help us understand that. And for you and I, friends, as we see the light and as we see ourselves in the light, we have to be changed, just like surely these magi, these wise men who traveled, were as well. And one way we're changed is that we realize that we have an important role and we have a great purpose, but in a story that isn't our own. We do have our own stories. I'm not discounting that. We've been talking this whole year about that, but we also have a role in a bigger story. God invites us to help tell people about this good news. God invites us, as we read just a couple of moments ago, to point to who God is and how the light has come to dwell among us, to point to what God is doing even here and now in our lives. A central part of who we are is to do that pointing, to be a part of that grander narrative, and to realize it's not about us. It's a beautiful invitation for us, friends. It doesn't have to be stressful. In fact, it can be a relief. There is an invitation for us into participation. So if you were worshiping with us Christmas Eve, you heard me talk about how all through the Christmas story, there is people who respond with a yes to an invitation. They choose participation. We talked about Zechariah, the jaded priest, and his wife Elizabeth, the once childless woman who bears both John the Baptist and good news and joy and encouragement and love all throughout her story. And we looked at Mary, whose plans got turned upside down, but who also sings a song of joy that the world has been turned upside down in this announcement and God's choosing to change all that was. And we looked at Joseph, who felt disappointment and betrayal and chose one simple, small, faithful step a day in response to that moment. We looked at the shepherds who believed that God's good news was big enough to include even them who had been forgotten and pushed out to the margins. And we looked at the Magi. Remember, they always come just a little bit late, who demonstrated the power of observation and response. And each of them in their own right models for us participation, responding to God's invitation, taking part in what God's doing, pointing to the light. We get to do that. And one way we do that is to point people to how God is moving in our midst. Are we aware of how God is moving in our midst? Do we take time to cultivate and reflect and pray and be aware of God's movement that is around us? In the midst of a world that can seem so dark, are we people who shine light, reflect light, point people to life? There is so much good happening, and we get to be a part of God's unfolding story in the world. That's one of the roles that we get to play. Now, I want to say just a word about that. Sometimes we talk about finding our part or playing your role, and we hear that as a bit of a negative. And I don't want us to hear that as a negative. I don't want us to think that means that we have to put on a mask. In fact, I think what this invites us to do is to take off our mask. To say that if we understand our core identity and that God has called us to point to the light, to tell others about the good news, what we can do is sort of let down some of our guard and stop feeling like we have to project something to somebody else. If we can be clear that that is one of our key roles as a follower of Jesus, to point others to who God is, then maybe we perhaps uncover a part of our true selves. And maybe as we point others to the light, we ourselves get to experience the light. So in a different book, Donald Miller talks about 4 roles that every good story must have. He talks about the victim and the villain, the hero and the guide. And each of us, in some way or another, we have all of those things. We have all that kind of energy within us. But he says that the story is always, any story is always about a hero on a mission who will be transformed along the way. And as they go on that way, they'll encounter villains who use their power to stand in the way of progress or to hurt other people. They'll encounter victims who simply let life happen to them instead of being transformed, instead of embarking on a journey. But the hero never does this journey alone. They always have a guide. Usually it's somebody older and wiser, someone who has gone on the journey and experienced some transformation themselves. It may be the same journey, it may be a different. It's the sage voice who speaks into the path of the hero who helps guide them. They may be around only for one scene, and yet maybe a pivotal player in the entire story. They may guide the character, the hero, throughout the many seasons of their life. They can see things beyond what the hero, the main character, can. Sometimes even within the main character, they can see things that the main character cannot. They make clear a path, they give guidance, they help steer away from issues and problems. I think of Frodo's Gandalf, or Mary Poppins, or the Karate Kid's Mr. Miyagi. We get to do that. As we are followers of Jesus, we get to guide people, we get to point people to the light, and we don't have to be the hero of the story to play an important and pivotal part. We get to be a part of a grander story. So I remember Many years ago, I believe my last year of undergrad, I was in this class. It was called The Helping Relationship, and it was for people who were going to be financial advisors, which is what I was there for, but also people in marriage and family therapy, folks who were studying to be social workers, all kinds of stuff. And so it was saying, like, in the helping relationship, here are some guidelines for how you would lead and how you would work. And the question came up one day. My professor said, what does leadership look like? And she brought up a student, and she said, does leadership look like this? And she grabbed the student's elbow and began to pull them forward. And she said, or does leadership look like this? And she got behind the student and pushed them on the back. Are you pushing or are you pulling? And I sat in the back of the room. I usually sat in the back of the room. But I sat in the back of the room, and I was thinking, and I was like, I don't think either of those is right. And I couldn't figure out what the answer was. And it was mulling around, and I didn't even know what to say. And she sort of asked everybody to say, which way do you imagine your leadership? And I guess I had a confused look on my face in the back of the room, because she said, Kyle, what are you thinking? And I said, I don't think it's either of those. She said, well, what is it? Come up and show me. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I walked up and I stood next to the student and I said, there, that's where we're going. That has guided my leadership ever since, is I realized that part of what I think good leadership is, and good storytelling is, and being a guide is to see something on the horizon, to imagine it, to make it clear, and to help people move in that direction. That's what I think leadership is. It's not about pushing or pulling. It's about helping people imagine something different. Friends, I think in our own way, we all get to do that. I think in their own way, the story of the Magi, as it's told by Matthew, does that. They aren't the center of the story. They're simply pointing to another truth. You and I, we're a part of a grand narrative that isn't about us. We get to point people to the light, to what God is doing. Each of us is called to help imagine or to help people see how God is moving, to give a vision of that in how we live and how we talk and what we point at, and to help people move in that direction. Perhaps a part of what we can learn in Matthew's story about the wise ones and their journey to Jesus is that we too get to point others to the light, that each of us have all of our individual struggles and our stories, and we're invited to live them with meaning and with purpose. That's what we're talking about this year. But we're also characters in that bigger narrative, that grander story, and God invites us to point others to the light. To be a blessing, to help folks remember and witness what God is doing in their lives, and to lead them into relationship, into love, into grace. So how is it that you'll do that pointing? How is it that you'll help others find the light in the year to come? Let's take a few moments for reflection.